The jungle night was thick and wet, the kind of darkness so complete that even shadows disappeared. Japanese soldiers crouched in their foxholes, gripping rifles slick with sweat, staring into a blackness they could not measure. The air smelled of damp earth, rotting vegetation, and the faint metallic tang of fear. Night was normally their ally. They moved silently under its cover, launched ambushes, slipped through American lines, and struck with the confidence of men who believed darkness belonged to them. But tonight was different. Tonight something burned in the distance, something white, unnatural, and growing brighter by the second. At first, the Japanese soldiers thought it was a flare. They had seen flares before. They knew their glow, their arc, their drifting descent. But this light didn't drift, it roared. And it was getting closer. One private lifted his head over the trench lip, squinting. The light intensified until it looked like a star falling to earth, trailing sparks that hissed as they cut through the humid air. Then the sound reached them, a deep, throaty whump, followed by the crackling roar of combustion. The ground trembled, men tensed. Officers shouted commands that were swallowed by the night. Then, without warning, the jungle exploded into blinding white fire. It arrived in massive arcs, streams of burning phosphorus fired from American Sherman tanks hidden beyond the ridge. The shells burst over treetops, splashing incandescent fire across leaves, roots, and dugouts. The Japanese soldiers who had grown accustomed to American high-explosive shells suddenly faced a nightmare unlike anything they had imagined. White phosphorus burned too bright to look at. It clung to vegetation. It clung to skin. It clung to air itself. And when it touched something, it did not just burn, it *ate. It ate through cloth. It ate through leather. It ate through flesh until nothing remained but bone and ash. The Japanese troops had heard rumors of this before, stories whispered among survivors who swore they saw American tanks belch fire at night, turning entire hillsides into fields of white ghosts. But few believed it. They thought it was propaganda or exaggeration meant to frighten fresh recruits. But now the horror was real. And it was spreading. The phosphorus shells burst with terrifying precision, each one illuminating the jungle like lightning frozen in time. Flames floated in the air, drifting downward on burning fragments that glowed unnaturally bright. Japanese soldiers who tried to retreat found their path blocked by fire. Those who tried to hide discovered the flames clung to anything that touched them. One soldier slapped at his uniform as phosphorus droplets landed on his sleeve. His screams echoed through the trees as the fire burrowed through cloth and into his arm. Water made it worse. Dirt barely slowed it. Only sand or complete smothering could extinguish it, but nothing was within reach. To the Americans, white phosphorus had many uses: illumination, smoke cover, marking targets. But in night battles against deeply entrenched positions, it became something more, a psychological weapon. And nothing on the battlefield terrified Japanese troops more than a weapon that defied the darkness they depended on. The Sherman crews firing the rounds worked in calm, practiced rhythm. They loaded each shell with care, knowing exactly what effect it would have. The tank commander scanned the horizon through night optics, identifying pockets of enemy movement invisible to the naked eye. When he gave the order, the gunner adjusted his aim. The loader rammed another phosphorus shell into the breach, and the tank roared again. Inside the Sherman, the crews felt heat but not fear. They were shielded by steel, operating a weapon they understood. They saw fire as a tool, a method, an advantage. Japanese soldiers saw it differently. To them, fire belonged to the gods, a force that cleansed and punished. A force that arrived suddenly and left no trace behind. White phosphorus at night felt like divine judgment. As the burning fragments fell, shadows danced violently against the trees. The flames illuminated faces twisted in panic, bunkers glowing from inside as their oxygen ignited. and running figures outlined by the sickening glow of incendiary material clinging to their clothing. Some soldiers flattened themselves against the earth, hoping the fire would pass over them. Others scrambled to deeper trenches only to find the phosphorus rolling into the pits like living droplets of light. Officers shouted for discipline, but their voices trembled as they watched their defensive lines melt under the assault. In one bunker near the ridge, a lieutenant tried to rally his men. He was young but determined, and he refused to show fear even as the jungle outside turned stark white. He crawled to the entrance and peeked out, and what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. The night was gone. The sky was white. The trees were glowing skeletons. And the American tanks, silent, invisible behind the brightness, fired again. He ducked back inside, eyes watering, breathing hard. "It's Phosphorus," he whispered. "The Americans, they've brought the fire." His men stared at him in disbelief. Some froze, others began muttering prayers. The lieutenant tried to regain control, but control had died the moment the first shell burst overhead. His men were no longer soldiers, they were shadow puppets caught in a theater of fire, reacting only to instinct and terror. As the Americans advanced through the glowing haze, infantry units moved behind the Sherman tanks, using the phosphorus as a shield. They stepped over charred roots and smoldering debris, rifles raised, advancing cautiously but confidently. The fire didn't touch them. The wind carried the smoke forward toward Japanese lines. To the American troops, this was strategy. To the Japanese, it was sorcery. For years, Japanese doctrine emphasized courage, initiative, and spiritual endurance. They believed men could overcome steel by willpower alone. They believed darkness was their ally, a blanket under which they operated with unmatched precision. They believed American forces were predictable and hesitant in the night. White phosphorus shattered those beliefs. One corporal, hiding behind a shattered log, watched as an entire section of his platoon vanished in a burst of white fire. He couldn't hear their screams at first, the explosion was too loud. But when the ringing in his ears faded, he heard the terrible sound of burning cloth, crackling brush, and men begging the earth to swallow them. He covered his mouth, trying not to breathe in the choking phosphoric smoke. His eyes strung, his skin tingled. The light was too bright to escape. He curled into a ball, trembling, and whispered, "The night is no longer ours." American tank crews didn't know the mental collapse unfolding ahead of them. They simply loaded and fired, advancing by the book. Their goal was to flush out defenders, weaken resistance, and secure the ridge before sunrise. They didn't imagine that Japanese soldiers were abandoning positions, dropping rifles, and fleeing deeper into the jungle without firing a shot. What the Americans saw as an effective tactic, the Japanese saw as a vision of hell. And it became worse. When burning trees collapsed, whole sections of the jungle lit up in brilliant white arcs, spreading the phosphorus further. Rotting leaves ignited, vines smoldered, ground fog glowed eerie pale blue as it mixed with smoke. The battlefield turned into a shimmering nightmare landscape where fire floated like spirits and shadows stretched impossibly long. Japanese soldiers who had survived artillery, machine guns, and starvation now found themselves facing something they could not fight, fire that chased them. One man sprinted through the trees, stepping into a puddle that had collected phosphorus droplets. His leg erupted in flame, illuminating everything around him. Snipers saw him instantly. He didn't make it 10 more steps. In another trench, 2 men desperately shoveled dirt onto a fallen comrade whose uniform still burned, but the phosphorus glowed under the soil. They screamed as they realized it was spreading across their hands. They plunged their arms into muddy water, making the flames flare brighter. Everything they did made it worse. The Americans continued forward, protected by distance, steel, and training. The Japanese felt hunted by an enemy that didn't need to see them to kill them. One Japanese officer later wrote in his diary, "Found months after the battle, the Americans brought the sun down upon us. The night betrayed us." As the battle continued, something else changed: sound. Japanese troops could always predict incoming American artillery by the distant rumble of tank engines, the grinding of gears, or the telltale clatter of treads. But Sherman tanks firing phosphorus at night often shut their engines off to reduce their visibility. Crews whispered instead of shouted. Infantry moved quietly behind them. The Japanese heard nothing, only fire. When another round burst above their heads, illuminating their panicked retreat, several soldiers halted abruptly, not from discipline, not from orders, from paralyzing terror. They couldn't tell if the next burst would land ahead, behind, or directly on them. The battlefield no longer had direction. It was a shimmering void of white flames and smoldering darkness. In one position, a Japanese machine gun crew tried to mount a defense. The gunner fired a short burst toward the approaching tanks, his muzzle flashes bright against the phosphorus glow, but firing made him visible. A Sherman gunner saw the flash and responded with a single shell. The explosion obliterated the position in a shower of dirt and sparks. A nearby soldier watched in disbelief. "They see everything in this fire," he muttered. "They see what the gods see." American tank commanders didn't see everything, they saw what their optics allowed. But from the Japanese perspective, the fire illuminated their every movement, every attempt to regroup, every attempt to counterattack, every attempt to survive. The battle had become asymmetrical in a way they could not overcome. White phosphorus destroyed more than bodies, it destroyed hope. Over hours, Japanese resistance deteriorated. Men hiding in trenches refused to emerge. Officers failed to get their troops to regroup. Communications fell apart as runners panicked and split into the jungle. Those who tried to send radio messages described the landscape as white fire, and night turned to day. The Americans took the ridge by dawn. When daylight broke over the battlefield, the truth became visible. Entire sections of jungle were charred black, roots smoldered, equipment melted, the air smelled of burned vegetation and something far worse. American soldiers walking the ridge found abandoned rifles, torn uniforms, and footprints leading away in every direction. In some trenches, the soldiers remained, but their faces were frozen in expressions of disbelief, eyes reflecting a horror that had not faded even in death. One American private whispered, "What happened here?" His sergeant answered quietly, "Phosphorus at night, they never stood a chance." But the story didn't end there. Japanese survivors who regrouped miles away tried to explain what had happened to their commanders. Their voices trembled. Their descriptions were disjointed, fire falling like rain, trees turning into floating ghosts, Sherman tanks appearing like monsters in the brightness. Commanders at first dismissed the accounts as exaggeration. Then more reports arrived. Then more. Then dozens. They all said the same thing. The Americans have found a way to turn night into fire. The senior Japanese officers gathered in a dimly lit command bunker, maps scattered across the table, lanterns casting trembling shadows on their faces. They listened to the reports with tightening jaws and darkening expressions. None of them had ever faced such chaos, chaos not created by overwhelming numbers or superior strategy, but by terror itself. They had expected American artillery. They had expected tanks. They had expected night attacks. But they had not expected fire that behaved like a living enemy. One officer, a veteran of multiple campaigns, studied the documents with disbelief. "White phosphorus," he muttered. "We knew they used it, but never like this." He looked up at the younger officers who shifted uncomfortably. Night is supposed to be our weapon, our shield, our advantage. If the Americans can take the night from us, then our positions, our tactics, our doctrine, everything is in danger. The room fell silent. Outside, the jungle hummed with insects and the distant roar of American artillery working to secure newly won ground. The Japanese officers knew they could not match this new capability. Their troops were brave, disciplined, willing to fight to the last man. But bravery meant little against a weapon that burned through courage as easily as it burned through vegetation. Meanwhile, the Japanese soldiers who survived that night's Phosphorus barrage had retreated several miles into thicker jungle, exhausted, filthy, and shaking uncontrollably. Their uniforms were burned, some hanging in tatters from their bodies. Many bore white scars where the phosphorus had splashed and burned deep. A few clutched their faces with bandaged hands, eyes reddened from the blinding glow. They gathered in small groups around hastily built fires, too afraid to close their eyes, too ashamed to look at one another. They whispered among themselves, voices trembling as if speaking too loudly might summon the fire again. One man, barely more than a teenager, stared into the flames with empty eyes. "I saw the trees moving," he said softly. "I saw them dancing in the fire." An older soldier beside him shook his head. Those were burning leaves falling from above. The younger man didn't seem convinced. "No," he whispered, "they were chasing us." The older soldier didn't argue. He simply placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, knowing words could not soften what they had endured. On the American side, tank crews cleaned their Shermans, scraping phosphorus residue from the barrel and reloading fresh shells for the next night's operation. They understood the power of their weapon, but few realized its full psychological impact. To them, it was another tool, one used carefully, following orders and strategy. They knew phosphorus forced the enemy to reveal themselves or flee their positions. But they didn't know the fear it was planting in the hearts of Japanese troops, fear that grew stronger with each night engagement. At dusk the next evening, American forces prepared to advance again. The jungle was calm, eerily calm, as if the earth itself held its breath. The men spoke in whispers. Sherman engines rumbled quietly. It was the kind of calm that precedes something unstoppable. When the first phosphorus shell launched, its glowing arc lit the sky. Japanese scouts watching from hidden perches saw the light and froze, not because they needed to observe, but because they could not look away. They felt the memory of the previous night surge through them like a wave of ice. The shell burst overhead. The jungle illuminated violently once more. This time, fewer Japanese soldiers remained in the first line of defense. Many had retreated early, fearing a repeat of the nightmare. Those who remained did only because of orders, but even the most loyal felt dread gnawing at their resolve. As flames spread across the canopy, the Japanese commander on the ridge shouted for anti-tank units to prepare. But the darkness betrayed him again. The phosphorus glow cast shifting shadows that made it impossible to determine where the Shermans were positioned. Soldiers fired wildly, desperate to hit something, anything, but they were firing into a storm of light and smoke. The Shermans responded with precision. Another phosphorus round, then another, turning night into an expanding inferno. A Japanese machine gunner tried to steady his aim, but glowing particles landed around him, flickering like white-hot embers. He ducked his head as the heat intensified. The ammunition belt melted. His hands blistered instantly. He fell backward, screaming, his cries drowned out by the crackling fire. Nearby, a squad leader tried to maintain order. He shouted commands, urged men to retreat in formation, but none obeyed. They ran in different directions, blinded and panicking. He reached for one soldier's arm to steady him, but the soldier pulled away violently, shouting, "The fire follows us. Run!" Retreat turned into chaos. Chaos turned into defeat. The Americans pushed forward behind the advancing waves of phosphorus and illumination rounds. Each explosion cast new angles of light across the terrain. exposing hidden foxholes, dugouts, and bunkers. American infantry quickly identified targets and cleared them with practiced efficiency. Some Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage, firing rifles and machine guns even as the light exposed them to every Sherman gunner watching. But courage crumbled in the face of burning sky. At one point, a Japanese officer attempted to rally his men by charging toward the American line. He leaped over a burning tree trunk, sword raised, shouting at the top of his lungs, but phosphorus droplets rained down on his path, speckling the ground like glowing stars. He slipped, stumbled into the fire, and vanished in a burst of white smoke. His men saw it and stopped dead where they stood. "No more," one whispered, "no more." On the third night, Japanese commanders attempted a counterattack, hoping to crush the American tanks with a sudden nighttime assault before phosphorus could be used again. They gathered their remaining troops, organized a silent advance, and approached under the cover of darkness, believing that stealth would protect them. They were wrong. American listening posts detected their movement, radar picked up their approach, and most importantly, Sherman crews were waiting. The first volley of phosphorus shells erupted in brilliant white arcs that tore through the treetops. The Japanese soldiers, advancing quietly in tight formation, suddenly found themselves surrounded by fire from above. The jungle floor flashed with glowing fragments. Men tripped over burning foliage, their uniforms catching fire as they stumbled and screamed. What began as a stealth maneuver collapsed instantly. Some soldiers threw themselves into shallow streams, only to find that phosphorus continued burning underwater, adhering to skin and fabric. Others curled into balls on the ground, covering their heads as the forest around them burned in unnatural colors. The Americans advanced once again, Sherman engines growling steadily as they rolled through smoldering terrain. Infantry followed, stepping over charred debris and avoiding pockets of lingering fire. They encountered less resistance each night, not because the Japanese had fewer troops, but because fear had hollowed out their will to fight. Word spread rapidly through Japanese units farther back in the line. They had expected American tanks. They had expected artillery. They had even expected flamethrowers. But no one expected fire that fell from the sky, clung to soldiers like a curse, and turned night battles into hellish panoramas of white flame. Men who had never retreated in daylight now begged their officers to withdraw at nightfall. Officers, themselves shaken, often struggled to enforce discipline. The old code of Bushido, which emphasized honor and fearlessness, seemed powerless against a weapon that killed without giving its victims a chance to fight back. One Japanese captain wrote in his field log, "This fire is not natural. It is as if the Americans control the heavens." American soldiers, unaware of the psychological devastation they were causing, pushed deeper into enemy territory. To them, each night victory was simply progress. One ridge taken, one bunker destroyed, one enemy position abandoned. To the Japanese, each night felt like a descent into madness. In the days that followed, Japanese officers attempted to adjust their tactics. They spread their troops farther apart. They moved artillery positions into deeper jungle. They dug bunkers with reinforced ceilings. But no matter what they attempted, phosphorus found them. It flowed into trenches, it stuck to tree trunks, it ignited bunkers, it turned thick foliage into tinder. During one reconnaissance patrol, an American sergeant observed the aftermath of a phosphorus barrage. He described it later. The jungle looked like winter, white patches everywhere, but when we stepped closer we realized it wasn't snow. Japanese soldiers who saw these landscapes felt their sanity slipping. Jungle warfare had always been brutal, but it had rules, predictable dangers, predictable tactics. Phosphorus erased those rules. One soldier, delirious and wounded, whispered to his companions, "The fire eats the night. It leaves nothing behind." Another said, "There is no place to hide, it sees everything." For Japanese troops accustomed to using darkness as a shield, the psychological impact was catastrophic. Fire wiped out camouflage, illusions, and confidence. Darkness betrayed them. On the fourth night, American forces targeted a particularly fortified ridge that Japanese command considered unbreakable. It had concrete bunkers, overlapping firing arcs, and machine gun nests designed to kill hundreds of approaching troops. Japanese officers expected to repel the American attack and restore morale. The Americans expected resistance too. But the moment the first phosphorus shells burst overhead, defenders fled their bunkers. Entire machine gun teams abandoned their posts. Officers screamed orders, but their voices were lost in the roar of burning trees and the crackling of phosphorus raining down. Some soldiers hid in drainage tunnels, others sprinted into the jungle, and many simply froze, as if their minds could not process what they were seeing. American infantry reached the ridge with minimal resistance. Sherman tank crews observing the abandoned bunkers exchanged puzzled glances. The position was strong, impressive. It should have taken hours to capture. Instead, it fell in minutes. "What happened?" a tank commander asked. His gunner shrugged. Phosphorus scared them off. But it was more than fear. It was disbelief turned to paralysis. The Japanese troops who had always believed they could outfight, outthink, or outmaneuver their enemy now confronted a weapon that made everything they knew irrelevant. A weapon that made bravery meaningless. In the following days, American operations intensified. Every night, Sherman tanks fired more phosphorus shells. Every night, Japanese troops faced the same nightmare. Their officers grew desperate, their troops exhausted. Some units refused to fight at night altogether. Others fought only when flames had burned out, preferring daylight battles despite the risk. American commanders began noticing patterns. Resistance was always weaker after a phosphorus barrage. Morale collapsed fastest among units with the least experience. Survivors of phosphorus burns often suffered severe trauma, unable to continue fighting. Even the sound of a Sherman's cannon without phosphorus caused Japanese troops to duck reflexively, anticipating fire rather than explosive force. A captured Japanese soldier provided chilling testimony. "At night, the jungle glows. We wait for the fire to choose us." American commanders realized they had discovered not only a tactical advantage, but a psychological weapon more effective than anything they had used before. And still the Japanese fought on, out of duty, fear of their officers, and the belief that surrender was shameful. But their spirit was straining, cracking under the relentless pressure of night after night of burning sky. Sherman crews continued their work, sometimes unaware of the horror unfolding ahead of them. To them, each phosphorus round was simply part of the mission. To the Japanese, each round was a message. The night belongs to America now.